friends, you are welcome to take a break whenever you need to. Stand up, get a cup of coffee, whatever you need to do, but we are going to continue on with what, if we were meeting in person, would be a second hour conversation. We have coffee hour. Unfortunately, you do have to bring your own coffee here in this current setup. But Jim, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hi. And we have some questions from the Earth Care team that I'd like to throw out to you, but also I want to invite everybody and anybody who's here who has a question or even just a response or something you would like to say in reaction to or in response to the worship service today and the words that Jim shared. You can write that question or those thoughts in the chat on Zoom. And we are going to do our best to keep an eye on those. And perhaps we will be able to respond to them. But I did have a good opening question from Dodie Siegel. And Dodie, I know you're here. Would you like to ask that question yourself? You can unmute yourself and ask the question if you would like.
You're unmuted.
Okay, Jim, I wanted to find out how you became interested in global warming and all that you've been involved with.
Well, I'll give a short response to that. Of course, I could have a much longer one. I come from a family of scientists. It turns out, this might surprise some people on the screen, that my dad was the head chemical engineer for Mobil Oil. So we were talking about the issues around fracking as early as 1958, when I was 8 years old in our household. My brother became a world-renowned scientist. He ended up focusing on charcoal and producing charcoal from any organic matter. I went to college to be a scientist, but somehow I read Soren Kierkegaard and made a turn. And here I am as you know, a collared minister. So it was really in the mid 70s. I was already following what was sometimes called global warming. Sometimes it wasn't really called climate change at that time as yet. And then I became really actively involved in it in the mid 80s. So I've been preaching on climate change since, I think my first sermon was in 1987 or 1988. And when I served local congregations, I would preach regularly on it. And then when I was conference minister of the 400 churches, UCC churches in Massachusetts, I had the opportunity to preach on it really every Sunday in a different church. So that's a brief answer. But that's how I got involved.
Well, thank you. And I think your reference to your family background in the oil industry leads nicely to the Pete Siegel question there. Pete, would you like to ask your question?
I'll try to phrase it as best as I can remember it. Many churches are thinking about divesting of their fossil fuel investments. But how about companies that are in the fossil fuel business now, but are moving toward clean energy? That is, investing in clean energy and looking toward a future when they become energy suppliers in a carbon-free world.
So Pete, thank you very much for that question. And it's so easy to get caught up in the storyline that the fossil fuel companies want us to believe. Let me offer just a bit of history and then respond to your question directly. Back in 1978, there's several people on the screen I can see are old enough to remember that there was an energy shortage. There were gas lines, and the fossil fuel companies they took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, which was rather unprecedented at that time. And it was very simple. Think of us as energy companies, not as oil companies. And that's because at that time, there was a question as to whether or not the availability of fossil fuel going forward, for a whole variety of political reasons mostly, would continue. Now, fast forward just a few years to the early 80s. At that point, the civil engineers working for the oil companies, particularly for ExxonMobil, they discovered horizontal drilling. Previously, that had been an impossibility. But in the early 80s, they discovered it. And at that point, the oil companies in their boardrooms said, we're not going to fund solar energy. We're not going to fund wind energy. We're not going to become an energy company. We're going to frack. And the reason we're going to frack is because America has endless amounts of oil if we can get at it through horizontal drilling. And as a consequence, 1989, 1990, fracking became a reality in America. And a few years ago, America became the leading oil producing company in the world as a consequence of horizontal drilling, which everybody on this call knows as fracking. Now, that's one piece of history. The other piece of history is that in about that same time, in the late 1970s, the oil companies hired the same fake scientists that prior to that the cigarette companies had employed in order to begin, this is in the early 80s, to begin their anti-science campaign and convince America that the whole notion of climate science was a fraud, it was fake. Now we have a president, of course, who buys into that and amplifies that message even more. So that leads me to answer your question. It is the case now that many of our fossil fuel companies are announcing by 2050 we're going to be carbon neutral or other kinds of things. Let me just assure you with those two comments about past history, the devil is in the details on all of this. The fossil fuel companies are in it for one reason and one reason only, and that is to provide their shareholders with immediate profits. And unless and until we change that, then divesting from them is the strongest way we can signal to them that they have to change that strategy. My final comment in regard, you may have a follow-up question, but in regard to what your question was, is that the divestment movement has been unbelievably effective. Bill McKibben wrote the first article on divestment in Rolling Stone magazine in August 2012. That Thanksgiving in August 2012, I wrote a resolution for the National Gathering of the United Church of Christ in 2013. We passed it, and we were the first religious body and the first national body in America to pass a resolution divesting from fossil fuel. No one imagined, and I speak for Bill McKibben when I say this also, that today, $14 trillion of portfolios have purged themselves of fossil fuel holdings. It's an astonishing number, and as a consequence, in its 2018 report, this is 2 years ago, Shell Oil Company said that the divestment movement constitutes a material threat to the fossil fuel industry. Who are involved in investing understand the phrase material threat. It's a real phrase. It's not about protesters. It's about in terms of their line. So those are a variety of comments relevant to your question. Thank you.
Just when things are getting juicy, I'm going to need to jump off and go hang out with some kids in a different Zoom room, but this conversation will keep going, and I'd like to hand it over to Margaret Randall, the chair of our Earth Care team, to ask a question. Margaret, are you all right with that?
I'm ready. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
we got you.
All right,
Got you loud
okay.
and clear.
Okay. The
Bye-bye,
question-
Heather.
She'll be back.
She'll be back, I think. My question is, how can we raise climate issues and take climate action in the middle of the pandemic? And are we losing valuable time? You know, when they say we have just a 10-year window. Can you talk to that a little bit, please?
So let me answer the second part of your question first. It turns out, in terms of the losing valuable time, and this is kind of unexpected, the polling that has been done over the past month or two, just the past month or two, when we were already 4 or 5 months into the pandemic, it indicates that that throughout America, people's concern about and willingness to engage the issue of climate change is actually increasing. Now, I would venture with great confidence that finally, with the kind of reporting we're getting around all of the forest fires out in the West Coast, much of that reporting is acknowledging and putting before the American public the reality that climate change has exacerbated these fires by, you know, a factor of 10 or 100. And that will also rally people, regardless of the coronavirus limitations. That will rally people. You know, what your question really gets at is, you know, how capable are we of handling two huge crises at the same time? And it's a completely legitimate question. And you know, as I look at all the wonderful faces on the screen here, as we all look at each other, different ones of us are capable in different ways of handling multiple crises, you know? We only had 2 children. We had 2 sons. We were blessed with 2 sons, but one of our sons has 3 children. I could not handle that. So that to me is like a comparison. Different people are capable of handling amounts. So I would just extend the invitation to, you know, anybody who's participating in this conversation or who heard the worship to really search your soul and ask, you know, how is it that I can join others? Because the worst thing you can do about climate change is to think I'm only an individual. My friend Bill McKibben says we have to stop being individuals. And that's like, really? How do I do that? Well, you do that by uniting with other people. And to, you know, up in Albany, I know that there are many, many, many strong environmental voices, strong climate action organizations up there. You're a congregation that affiliates with all kinds of others. If you're not yet affiliated with the local Sierra Club or with the local 350.org or with the local Sunrise Movement or with the local Extinction Rebellion movement, those would be great organizations for you all to affiliate with.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Extinction Rebellion movement?
Well, so let me say that the Extinction Rebellion movement is a little peculiar. It manifests differently in each community where it has a chapter. So unlike the Sierra Club, which, you know, you can go to the National Sierra Club website and you can get a sense of, oh, the Sierra Club, 130-year history and all of that. The Extinction Rebellion movement, it's really more of a spontaneous movement. It originated over in England. It has been picked up here in America. It's a little chaotic. There are actually 2 different variations here in America. One of them says environmental justice, economic justice, and racial justice all need to be taken together. The other one, a more conservative one, says, no, we're only focusing on environmental justice. Well, the sort of, to the extent that there's a coordinating group for Extinction Rebellion, they've said, nah, that's not us. We're all about uniting all justice concerns. And the reason is, and this is an important reason, it was evident in my sermon, but it's important for all of you to realize, climate change amplifies all injustices. I noticed in your mission moment in worship, you're affiliated with a lot of Albany organizations that deliver food. Well, the food crises that the world is already facing and will face increasingly going forward are all going to be amplified by climate change. We haven't heard much about it, but in Iowa, they had this storm in Iowa like 3 or 4 weeks ago, by a name that I had never heard before, this a derecho, and it destroyed 40% of Iowa's crops. Now, we haven't heard much about that, actually, because we've been, to your point of your question, we've been kind of watching so many other issues going on. But, you know, you can only destroy 40% of a crop so many places in the world before you have massive hunger problems, as Africa is facing right now, too. So that's I kind of wandered around on there, but it was all sort of relevant to your good question. Thank you.
Yeah. Nancy Ost, I'm going to ask your question. Nancy says, the environmental justice movement tends to get overwhelmed by all the other crises. How do we keep the continuing health issues of the minority neighborhoods front and center?
Well, one of the ways to do it is to continue to provide a platform for Black and people of color and Indigenous people who already have their own organizations led by them, to provide a platform in order to distribute their ideas and their leaders. I think that's some of the most important thing that can be done. Sierra Club has made a major commitment over the past 3 months. It has re-examined its pattern of behavior and has committed to doing exactly the kind of thing I just said, and they're doing a great job. So it's almost like discovering, hey, it's not just us that think that that's important. There are actually people on the ground, people of color, who are bearing witness and who know a heck of a lot. And we should be pushing their messages out. I think that's my best response to that question.
Okay.
Dan Kirk Davidoff has his hand raised to ask a question. Where is Dan? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Speak.
Hi, Jim. Thanks so much for your passion on this issue over the years. Really interesting to hear about your family background. I'm a climate scientist, so this stuff is close to my heart. And yeah, I've been working on this also since around 1988, although that's when I was going into my junior year in college. I had a couple of thoughts. I had a question about just a further push on the divestment issue. If you're just divesting from fossil fuels and you're not making an affirmative decision about what to invest in, the result is probably going to be, if you're talking to an investment advisor and trying to maximize returns, but I don't want to invest in fossil fuels, the result is going to be a lot of investment in Facebook and Apple and Microsoft and so on. And we all know that those organizations, are a somewhat mixed blessing. And then more broadly, there's an issue that the reason we have investment decisions to make, those of us who have investment decisions to make, is because we're sitting on big piles of cash, and we would like to, lend that cash out to other people to, and then have them, pay us rents on that. And so I guess I'd like to ask two questions. One is, if we really want to use those piles of cash to make the world better, how would you suggest going about that? And number two, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between some people and organizations sitting on big piles of cash and all of the other problems that you've grouped together?
Well, so that's a big question, and I have some knowledge in that area, but there are, let me begin to address the question in this way. In 2014, so this would have been a year after the UCC National Gathering voted to divest, the most progressive individual congregations in the UCC began to scratch their heads and saying, geez, we have an endowment, should we be divesting it? And I met with, as the leader of this thing, I met with, I don't know, probably a dozen different finance committees from those congregations. And to a person, they would invite their specific financial advisor who may or may not be a member of the congregation. And they would say, like, you can't have a balanced portfolio and divest from fossil fuels, right? And now, and not even now, I would say as of 2016, no credible financial advisor would ever say that, because by 2016 there were really an unlimited number of ways to balance your portfolio that would exclude fossil fuel companies. So it's not a hard thing. It's not a hard thing to get done. And of course, it's also the case, as many people on this conversation would know, that the worst thing to be invested in over the past 4 years, I think is the duration at the moment, would be fossil fuel companies. They have gone down the most of any sector in the investment world over the past 4 years. Now, that said, another dimension of your question would be that these same financial advisors are also becoming more and more aware, geez, you can divest from fossil fuels and invest both responsibly and fiduciarily profitably. You can invest in solar and wind and other forms of sustainable energy. And so most of the people I talk with, they're divesting here and investing there, and that's going well. The way you phrased your question is unusual, and I really want to amplify that. And that is that if you're blessed and you do have financial assets, those assets can be used not only to own assets, but they can be used so that another organization or another individual can have fun their justice work that they would otherwise not have. And there are a variety of opportunities to do that. But to give general kind of advice on that, it's almost irrelevant, because it's going to depend on each person and each individual in that regard. I know you appreciate that. So those at least are my initial responses. This could be a very long and excellent discussion, and it's one really worth having. I don't know if your congregation has an endowment. I suspect it probably does. I don't know if you all have looked at this issue previous to this, but if you haven't, now is as good a time as any to start. So thank you, Dan.
Actually, we are in the process of doing that right now.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I had, just to give you some hope in this regard, Riverside Church, which many people on this call would know was built in the 1920s by Rockefeller, so it was built with all oil money. They in 2014, when we had the big climate march in New York, I met with their environmental committee, which was also sort of a divestment committee. They had an endowment at that time, I think, of about $200 million. And my guess is it was all Exxon stock. So divesting for them was not a small decision. So I did my best to sort of set the stage and recognize, listen, this is a big challenge and so forth. But I was so pleased. This year I gave the sermon at Riverside Church. It was like this one, on a Zoom sermon, but for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And a year before, it was the 1-year anniversary of Riverside Church having successfully divested.
Wow.
I don't know how big their endowment was at that time, but Riverside Church, you know, built by Rockefeller, was possible stuff.
Great.
Can
Okay.
I just put in one more thing real quick, because
Sure.
you brought up about Extinction Rebellion and their sort of
Cattail.
bifurcated nature. The Albany chapter of Extinction Rebellion is a great group of people, and they are not, they're on the side of, you know, combining climate and justice issues, which has had a really strong track record in the state of New York, because that's how we got the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act passed, which
Yeah.
is a really strong act that combines justice concerns and really strong action on climate. So, and with that, I will stop talking. Thank you very much.
And
Thank
you
you.
know, just to build on what you said, Dan, these organizations, if a church reaches out to them and say, we want to affiliate with you, it often just blows their mind, because their understanding of religious people or of church is oftentimes sort of shaped by Fox News and how they portray Christians in America. And obviously your congregation and my denomination and most of your denomination also ain't like that. So I would just urge you to, you know, knock on that door as a possibility for affiliation.
Okay.
I have one question here, Jim. There are still climate change deniers around. Do you have any thoughts about how to engage them? I know we need to listen to people carefully and care for them, but what kind of approach have you been using with folks like that?
So of course, that's a great question. So I'll offer a couple of distinct responses to that. First of all, over the past 3 years, if you look at the polling that's been done over the past 3 years, the percentage of Americans who are part of that, you know, firm climate denial perspective has shrunk from, you know, roughly 20% to, you know, 12% thereabouts.
Mm.
So that's point number one. Point number two, that group of climate deniers have also hardened their attitudes. So that leads to point number three. The likelihood of convincing them that they are wrong is near zero.
Yeah, right.
Now, your question would still be pertinent to somebody who is maybe not in the hardened core, but is sort of kind of in that general camp. And then my fourth comment in relation to your question is the best person to provide guidance on how to interact with somebody who is skeptical or a denier is a climate scientist who is also an evangelical Christian.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Her name is Catherine Hayhoe.
I know.
Hayhoe.
Yeah, I know her. Yeah.
Her website is fabulous. And in 2.5 minutes, Catherine Hayhoe can give you the most convincing coaching on how to talk with a person. You know, it begins with talk to that person about something they value that you also value, establish that common connection, and then share with that person how it is climate change threatens that thing that you both value. And that's what can move a person who's not hardened, but a person who is, you know, skeptical or inclined in that direction. It can move them to say, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, that's great. I don't want to step on anybody else's questions. I don't see anything. There is a question, another question I have. Could you say something, Jim, about the Green New Deal? I know nationally, and New York State is dealing with its own version of that, but nationally, could you say something about the Green New Deal that's being worked on? And
so I'll start off with a sort of a kind of a top level comment about it. People who say, you know, the Green New Deal, it packs in there too many things that have nothing to do with green, or that it's way too costly. Those are the two principal criticisms of the Green New Deal. And of course, we have seen in the past 5 months commitments in the trillions in order to address this pandemic. Well, you know, addressing the pandemic will be one way or another a temporary challenge to the world. But climate change will be with us for an unlimited number of generations going forward. And to go all in financially, in terms of resources, in terms of shifting our employment focus in this country, all the things that the Green New Deal does, to go all in with the Green New Deal is exactly what is needed in order to just begin to address the catastrophe that really only 7 generations of humans have created. So that's kind of a headline for it. Does it have to do with, I'm thinking of different components of the Green New Deal. Does it have to do with healthcare? Does it have to do with employment? Does it have to do with shifting our financial incentives from the subsidies we now provide for fossil fuel companies, which is measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year? As taxpayers, everybody on this call should know that we in America pay hundreds of billions of dollars, tax dollars per year, to subsidize oil and coal and gas companies. That blows a lot of people's minds. Just beginning by ending that, which is one of the things that the Green New Deal does, is to end that. All of these things are being fought tooth and nail by the fossil fuel companies, of course. But if we have a change in the White House and a change in the Senate in the upcoming election, we'll be in a good position, I hope, to make those changes. But they will be dramatic, and I'll conclude by just saying the reference to the New Deal is not a small thing. Everybody who knows history knows how significant the shift was back in the early 30s to the New Deal. We need to make a bigger shift than that in order to just begin to get a handle on climate change.
Wow. Is there anybody else who has a question who'd like to speak up if you want to? I don't see any more on the chat list.
Can I just add one more
Okay.
point to that, Dan, again? You know, one thing that really,
Dan speaking from the parking lot of the Westminster Presbyterian Church, if I'm not. Yep, there you are. Oh yeah, by the way, Jim, there's our church, if you're wondering.
Yes, I saw it
like
steeple.
from the outside. Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in regard to that, and yeah, you'll appreciate this, Jim. I know you know this, but you know, the total, the fraction of CO2 that has been emitted to the atmosphere over all time, that's been emitted since like 1988, when Jim Hansen said, "Hey, this is a big problem. We really should do something about it," is approaching half, if I understand, if I have the numbers right in my head. So, you know, although it may seem like a problem of the ages, like, oh my God, you know, people have been emitting carbon dioxide since the first coal plants in the, you know, 18 whatevers, and how are we going to stop all of a sudden? Well, actually, we've done this all of a sudden. Like, we've just been we've done a huge binge towards more and more fossil fuel generation. So if we think about it as a problem that we've essentially caused over 30, 40 years, the idea that we would, you know, get rid of that problem over a similar timescale doesn't seem so crazy.
Well said, Dan. Thank you.
Jim, you've given us a whole lot to think about and really a lot to be hopeful about, but I would like to close with this question. Where do you find hope in the middle of all this?
Well, I often get asked this question, and where I find hope is anytime I am connecting, it could be with a group of people or it could be just with a single individual. And what I discover is that person kind of realizes they are not alone, but their arms are locked with millions of other people worldwide. So, Greta Thunberg in Sweden over the past 2 years, we did not know her name 2 years ago.
That's true.
How? Really?
True.
It was 2 years and 3 weeks ago that she began alone out in front of the Swedish Parliament there in the capital with her sign. And I think everybody on the call has heard her name and knows she's Person of the Year and blah blah blah. And hundreds of millions of kids have joined her, as have many grown-ups. Anytime any individual or congregation begins to affiliate with others so that their passion and concern is then leveraged and amplified, that gives me hope. The other thing I would say, and this is a good thing to close on, is, we are more or less 50 days away from the election. And I've been an activist, all my life, but in the environmental activist movement, I have never seen such a clear, unambiguous emphasis on the importance of an election. And anything anyone in this conversation can do to manifest their concern for God's creation by working toward making sure as many people vote as that the maximum number of people vote, and maybe even finding ways as I know is possible to not just work in your state, because New York may not be so much of a problem. I'm in Vermont, and certainly Vermont is not a challenge. But you can also, even being in New York, you can do work in other places which are more challenging, like Wisconsin, like Nebraska, or like Wyoming. So those would be two answers around the hope question. Maybe a way to sign off at Heather's face when I say this. Having known Heather for a few decades, my guess is that you all will probably be treated sometime between now and November to something that most people will regard as an election sermon. And I'm not suggesting that you do that or not do that, Heather, but if you are, I always preached an election sermon in my 20 years as being a pastor, every 4 years. There's a long history to that. It turns out the first election sermon was preached back in like 1640 by our congregational forebears. So I just want to grease the skids for that and suggest that if you all hear an election sermon, just know that there's an almost 400-year-long history of those in our congregations.
And so I shouldn't lose my job 4 months in for giving an election sermon. Okay.
Exactly.
That's and if that does happen, I'll come back to the United Church of Christ seeking another opportunity. So, friends, this has been terrific. There is a couple of questions in the chat, Jim, about further resources to follow you. Do you have a podcast? Do you have?
I have a website, and I post on that website upcoming stuff that I'm doing. Obviously what I'm doing over the next several months, it's all Zoom and so forth. But I would love to have any of you engaged in it. That's the easiest way to find me. It's jimantal.com.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for finding us. Thanks for being open to a sort of out of the blue email from people that whose name you didn't recognize. And thanks for making the connection between our church and you just a little bit more friendly. May it continue, and our blessings to you on your work.
Heather, might you repeat his website for us?
Jim Antal's name is JIMANTAL, and that is the website, is jimantal.com. Yep.
Okay.
Yep, there we go. Very, very easy. And with that, friends, we will sign off. Go out and enjoy creation today. It is a glorious day here in upstate New York, and I hope it's equally beautiful out there in Vermont.
It is.
and let's enjoy God's good creation today.
Thanks so much, Heather. Thanks, everybody.